Hi, everybody. I want to thank those of you that have taken any time to take a look at some of the recent videos that I posted. About a month or so ago, I started posting some of my first videos. I've had a lot of fun posting videos and making these videos and putting together some messages, and I hope you've had just as much fun watching some of them. Admittedly, the last few that I've put up, I tried to shift gears a little bit, make them a little bit more lighthearted, have a little bit more fun, put together a couple parodies. But I wanted to have a very different tone to today's video. I didn't want to use the aid of any type of visual aids or graphics or any type of other accompaniment. I wanted to face the camera this time and tell a little bit of a story, if you don't mind. One of the things I was hoping to do when I first started putting together some notes for what I wanted to talk about today, I was thinking about all the different channels that I've watched. Where I've listened to stories, people who are still in jw.org or the organization, those that have recently woken up and are in the process of fading. Some people have written disassociation letters or been disfellowshipped, as the case might be. And I recognized aspects of my own story in almost every story that I listened to. So in trying to put together a list of all the different channels, I want to say thank you to literally, there's too many people to even list. When the list got started, I was running out of space on the paper. So so as not to forget or overlook anyone, I'm not really going to mention any specific channels. You've probably seen my comments on some of your channels, those of you that I watch frequently. So I want to just give a heartfelt thank you to everybody who's taking any time out of their day to tell their story. It's really, really appreciated. And one of the things that I find it does personally is it helps me to be able to put into perspective some of my own story. So to give you some background, one of the things I want to talk about today is a topic that I just found out about within the last couple weeks. My wife was talking to a friend of hers, and her friend mentioned this topic of religious trauma syndrome, or RTS, and I've never heard of religious trauma syndrome before. My wife is not a witness. When we met about 9 years ago, one of the things that was always a little difficult for me, even though I was not a witness at the time when we first met, was I wanted her to be able to understand me better and kind of understand my background. And a big aspect of a good portion of my life, about the first 30 years of my life, a good portion of that was the identity that came along with being a Jehovah's Witness, and to have family members that were still actively Jehovah's Witnesses. And she had some questions sometime about things that would come up as I was dealing with my family member or our interactions, and to give her a better understanding, I had to explain, well, before you and I met for many, many years, this is what I was, this is who I was, this is what I did. And the act of having to try to explain that was difficult. Some things were easier than others. Anyway, when I found out about this religious trauma syndrome, I wasn't sure what it was. Apparently it's a phrase that was coined by a therapist by the name of Marlene Winnell. And what she found in decades of being a therapist is that she found that people who were brought up in very strong fundamentalist faith had issues of anxiety and issues dealing with thoughts of abandonment, for an example. And so it wasn't something that was unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. There's a variety of different faiths that she mentions on her website. Jehovah's Witnesses is one of them. Mormons is another one. Some Pentecostal groups. The list goes on and on. But it's interesting that in her work with her patients, she was able to identify some root causes or some commonalities in the stories and backgrounds of these people that come from different faiths, but yet still we're wrestling with some of the same issues. One issue is being raised in a very strict fundamentalist type of faith. And then a second, probably even just as important aspect, is people who have made the decision to, as an adult, leave that path, to leave the fold, to leave that faith, and make changes in their belief system, and the anxiety that goes along with it, and some of the psychological impact of a change that's that tremendous in somebody's life. So one of the things that I had noticed when I was watching and commenting on some of these stories that I was hearing from others was that it seemed to me that there was a little bit of a difference between stories where people became a Jehovah's Witness as an adult. Maybe they studied in their teens or as a young adult or during an adult portion of their life and chose to become a Jehovah's Witness, as opposed to people who were raised within the Jehovah's Witness faith, where it was the faith of their families. They came into the world, and the only identity and the only worldview that they had was being a Jehovah's Witness. And I noticed that there were slightly different aspects to the stories of people who were brought up in the faith. So what it got me to thinking about is, when I was young, I was growing up in the pre-1975 generation. So although I was too young to really understand what was going on, why was this year of 1975 focused on so much, I knew that something was going on. And in the early 70s, there was no publication, My Book of Bible Stories, which was really geared toward children. So at the time, there were two publications that were geared toward children, one of which was this small little Pepto-Bismol colored pink book called Listening to the Great Teacher. And then there was a larger orange book that was called, it was the Paradise Book, From Paradise Lost to Paradise Regained. And unlike the My Book of Bible Stories, there were a lot of Bible stories in them. However, some of the visual aids weren't quite up to snuff as far as being full color or four color printings. Rather, they were line drawings. But I still have very early memories of being a little boy, and my father would be reading from the Paradise Book. And there was a depiction in that book of what it was going to be like at Armageddon. So there was a picture of a lightning bolt hitting a skyscraper, and that skyscraper was pitching forward down into a crowd of people. And I can't recall specifically whether or not it was the same image or in an image nearby that. There was another depiction of the earth opening up and people falling down into the ground, being swallowed alive. Cars were going down into this gaping abyss. Adults, men, women, children. And what really made me upset as a little boy was there was a picture of a dog going down into this abyss right next to a little child. And it was so hard for me to understand, why would this loving entity, first of all, be so mad at humankind that he would snuff out the lives of all these people, and including innocent, helpless animals. It just didn't make sense with all the other things that I was learning. So when I was reading about this religious trauma syndrome, one of the things that really stood out to me was the fact that this doctor had mentioned that young children don't really have the cognitive ability to be able to process and make sense of some of these very, very strong concepts. Whether it's a faith that has hellfire, for example, whether it's the concept of the rapture and people being judged worthy, being caught up to heaven, and those that remain behind having to live through the end of the world, or these concepts of Armageddon with these very strong depictions. So that resonated with me. It was something that I could understand, that looking back in my own recollections and my own memories, that was very difficult for me. Even the whole concept of God when I was younger was something that I went along, and I went to the meetings, and they were always talking at the Kingdom Hall about Jehovah. And it was hard to, I knew that Jehovah lived in the sky, and he lived in heaven, and he was always looking down on us. But the image that I had as a young boy of who Jehovah was, there was an elder in our congregation when I was growing up, and he was, everybody's tall when you're a little one, but I remember him being tall, and he had very short hair, and it was kind of like a buzz or a brush cut, and it was salt and pepper or gray. And for many, many years in my life, many more years than I really want to probably admit, I always pictured that elder's face when I thought of Jehovah. And I figured, well, he's up on the stage all the time, so that must be the person that they're talking about when they talk about Jehovah. At the same time, too, again, going back to the early 70s, there was a time period where Jehovah's Witnesses were being persecuted in various lands. And I have these other memories of hearing about praying for the brothers and sisters that were in Malawi. And something was going on in Malawi and in Mozambique, I believe it was. And I didn't even know what those things were, where those places were, but all I knew that there were families just like my family, there were children just like I was, and they were being persecuted unjustly so because they were Jehovah's Witnesses. So I was expected to pray, and I remember praying for the brothers in Malawi with whatever it was that they were dealing with. And I do remember being at the hall, and unlike a lot of churches that have Sunday school, where they have special classes or training where the children are brought to a certain area and they're given age-appropriate topics to learn about their religion and their faith, when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're expected as a child to sit in the main auditorium with your parents, with your family, and listen to what's being discussed. And I have so many memories of listening to sometimes very graphic depictions of persecution, whether it was stories of World War II and in concentration camps, or these stories about what was going on in Malawi. And in that type of environment, it was, looking back, I can't even imagine bringing my young son to any type of church service or any type of religious worship, where he would be exposed to this concept that the whole world is against you because you've chosen to have the faith that you do, or because your family has the faith that they do. The devil is focusing on you. The devil is going to make this conclusion of the system of things just as difficult as possible, in the hopes that even under torture that you will renounce your faith. I couldn't imagine doing that to my child. So when I was reading about religious trauma syndrome, and I just was honestly recollecting and thinking about my own upbringing and how difficult so many aspects of my earliest memories of going to the Kingdom Hall, I can see how that would have a negative impact on somebody. So there were a couple things that were brought out in this, in what I've watched and what I've researched about a religious trauma syndrome. I just wanted to share with you. If it's something that makes sense for you and it's something that can be helpful, it's just put forward for your consideration. I am not a behavioral therapist. I am not a psychotherapist. I'm not in the medical field at all. I just wanted to share with anybody who would be interested in finding out about it what this topic was. One of the things that was mentioned is to recognize in yourself as an adult that when you have these feelings of intimidation and these feelings of panic, it could be, for example, something like on 9/11. It really had a tremendous impact on me, just like it did probably with everybody who's watching this. That day in September 11th, 2001, when we were watching the plane fly into the World Trade Center, as horrific as that was, and realizing we were watching the end of the life of thousands of people. But when the tower started to fall and this tower started to come down, the feelings that I had were reminiscent of those feelings of looking at the Paradise Book and seeing the skyscraper fall down. And intellectually, I completely understood that what I was watching on the news was not Armageddon. I knew it wasn't. I knew that it was some sort of terrorist attack. But on some level, the way that I was reacting to it, I had to consciously tell myself, almost, that this is not Armageddon. This is an atrocity that you're watching. It's terrible to watch, but it's not Armageddon. The feelings that I had and the thoughts that I was wrestling with were part of the indoctrination. It's a control mechanism. The control mechanism tells you that if you are not part of the belief system, you are doomed now and you are doomed eternally because you've chosen to leave the protection of this faith. So I recognize that most notably during 2001, during the terrorist attacks. J.W. Crisis on his channel recently, I believe it was within the last week or so, put out this video where he was talking about the society, or excuse me, I keep wanting to call it the society, jw.org and the organization, their policy anytime that there's any type of news event that has anything to do with terror is leave it in God's hands. Two things, one of which the Bible says that we will live in critical times, hard to deal with, and all the bad things that will be happening. So when we see these terrorist attacks, when we see these things that we can't explain, it's in fulfillment of Bible prophecy. It's critical things, critical times, hard to deal with. And then the second thing is there's nothing that we can do about it. We are powerless to do anything about it. The only thing we can do is pray for God's kingdom to come as soon as possible, because that is what, we'll leave it in God's hands. That's the only cure that there possibly is. So I'm thinking about people in Europe, for an example, in Paris and in Nice and in Istanbul and these other areas across the world that are dealing with some of these terrorist attacks that are hitting close to home. And I'm thinking, I wonder how many people are dealing with the same type of thoughts that I wrestled with after the September 11th attacks. And maybe there are some out there that are. So I was pretty much faded by the time fall of 2001 came around, but I was still going to some meetings. And I heard exactly what Gilbert at JW Crisis, I heard exactly the same thing that he was mentioning. Critical times hard to deal with, leave it in Jehovah's hands. That was not comforting. That didn't give me any spiritual solace to hear that message. But one day I was driving in my car. I'm a salesperson by trade, or I was at that point, and I spent a lot of time on the road, and I was listening to a talk show, and this one caller calls into the talk show, and this, not a priest, not a minister, just a person. And the person was saying that they went to their church on that Sunday, and a scripture was read to them that gave them comfort. And it might kind of piqued my curiosity. I'm like, well, I wonder what the scripture was. And at their church, their minister got up and read a passage in Romans chapter 13. Now, Romans 13 was something that I was familiar with as a witness, because it talks about the superior authorities, that God allows governments to have relative authority, and that we as good Christians should follow the reasonable expectations that government has of us, that we should pay our taxes and things like that. But this person who called into the talk show said that their minister specifically focused on the verse within Romans chapter 13 that said that one of the things that God gave governments the ability to do is He gave them a sword and gave them the permission and the expectation to wield that sword to bring to justice those who are causing crime and injustice. And I thought about it, and I'm thinking, how strange is that? I've been going to the Kingdom Hall my entire life at this time. And I'm not trying to suggest that one scripture was that the heavens opened up and I saw this clarity, but just having some interchange with another person that shared that here was at least some effort to give a congregation solace by saying, it's not just a question of God will take care of it. There already was a mechanism that God had put in place to take care of terror in people who are evildoers. That God set up governments, or God allows governments to be in these positions of authority, and they have military, and they have law enforcement, and they have the ability to bring to justice those that are practicing lawlessness. It was such a simple concept. And I'm thinking, why didn't I hear something like that at the Kingdom Hall? So anyway, again, one of the points that I found and I appreciated when talking or when doing research about religious trauma syndrome was recognizing the way our mind works, recognizing my own mind and my own thoughts. That if there is a terror attack, and you might be forgiven for thinking, well, maybe they're right, maybe maybe Jehovah's Witnesses were right all along, because look at the financial markets are collapsing, and I've always heard that, at some point our money's going to be worthless and we're going to be throwing our gold into the street. So when you hear about the markets collapsing, maybe that's it. Or any time that a politician happens to use the term peace and security, maybe your mind flashes on that scripture that's always read at the Kingdom Hall, is that as soon as they are saying peace and security, then sudden destruction is to be instantly upon them. So there's a variety of stimulus and stimuli that we could be exposed to by watching the news and keeping up with current events that might occasionally trigger some of these things. And that reaction of intimidation and that reaction of anxiety and panic that you might be feeling, it's all part of the indoctrination. So recognizing it for what it is, it does not necessarily mean that Jehovah's Witnesses were right all along. What it means is that even years and years removed from this indoctrination, some of this stimuli can still bring up immediately to the surface things that are difficult to deal with. So there's another recommendation that this Dr. Winnell gives on her website and some of what I was researching. It's helpful to expose yourself to as much information as possible. That's one of the primary reasons that I've spent so much time as I have on YouTube in the last year. Personally, I just left in 2001, so it was about 15 years ago. I pretty much just left cold turkey. There wasn't really any grand design to my leaving, and I never really thought too much about it, with the exception of when my father's memorial service was held in 2007. I flew back to where my family lived to attend that, and that was less of a memorial to my father than it was a Watchtower infomercial, and maybe I'll make a separate video about that. But I never really thought too much about my former faith until last summer, when I accidentally stumbled across the hearings of the Australian Royal Commission, and I refamiliarized myself with what are the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses now. And to be very forthright, I didn't even recognize the faith that jw.org had become in just the decade and a half since I last had anything to do with it. So when I was reading about a healing process is to expose yourself to information, I think part of that is expose yourself not to just the stories that are put out by the official channel of watchtower.org, which has now become jw.org, or just reading the printed materials. There's a tremendous amount of information that's available on the news, as well as so many different reference works and websites and YouTube channels that will give you information not just about what's going on within Jehovah's Witnesses now, but also to understand what got today's version of JW.org from where it started back in the 1870s with Charles Taze Russell. So becoming more familiar with the history of the organization, and then beyond that, let's completely remove it from JW.org, just to be able to learn about the things that I was interested in, to be able to pursue books or watch films or documentaries or do research about topics that I was interested in without having to think, is this something that's okay for me to be watching? So by doing that, listening to music, reading books, fiction books, there's nuggets that I get from reading fiction books even, not just history and nonfiction. All of those little things help me to build up a background and a mental database and cache of information that just helps me to live my life today. I don't need everything to be coming to me through religion. That's just one aspect of life. It's not the sole channel that dictates all of the things that I can do as a person. And the other thing is, I have a personal responsibility. I have a personal responsibility to be a good father, to be a good spouse, to be a good neighbor, to be a contributor to my community, the community that I moved to, that I chose to live here. How can I make my community a better place? Jehovah's Witnesses really do pride themselves on the fact that they are neutral, that they don't take part in politics. Because if you take part in politics, the argument goes, you're taking sides or taking a stand against Jehovah. And I will say that there are so many things that take place within a political conversation that have nothing to do with universal sovereignty. I'm a taxpayer. I pay taxes. So much of what happens within my locality, my ward, my community, the city that I live in, has to do with things like referendums, or who would I want to be on the school board or the city council, and whether or not I want to have a voice as to whether or not the city or the school system spends our tax dollars one way or the other. It has nothing to do with universal sovereignty. It's all part of being part of the conversation. So instead of leaving it in God's hands, there are some aspects of everyday life that we get the privilege of lending our voice to. What do we want to have done, and how do we want it done? So we get to participate in making our neighborhoods a better place, in making our cities and communities and states and our country a better place. And if you want to think on a grander scheme than that, if the topic that impassions you is literacy or the environment and protecting the environment, there's so many causes that could benefit from your efforts. So growing up, I couldn't be involved in sports. I really liked baseball when I was growing up. I still do, but I could never dream about playing on the school team, because that would take time away from meetings. Or I couldn't develop this interest or that interest, just like on the 2016 convention program when Sergei could not practice the violin, or he couldn't go to the conservatory to develop that interest. There's so many interests that I've had over the years that I know that I had to put on a back burner simply because it would detract from volunteer work in the community, handing out magazines. So if you are no longer encumbered by that sense of commitment that I have to go out and field service, and I have to go to all these different meetings, if that's no longer part of your day-to-day life, take that time that you used to spend doing that and invest in yourself first. Become a whole person. Find out who you are. Find out what your interests are. Don't let somebody else dictate to you what your interest should be. Find out what your interests are and cultivate that. Become engaged. Be part of something bigger than you. Be part of the community. So as opposed to sacrificing your life for a promise that is not going to come, we've been given an opportunity to live this life. Enjoy it. Find people that love you. Find people that you can love. Find friends that have similar interests to you and develop those interests together. We don't need perfection in order to be happy. You can be happy in a very, very imperfect world. There's an old, I guess it's a joke. There's an old joke that says, or story that says something to the effect of that there was a true believer that found himself caught in a terrific rainstorm or hurricane. And he was standing on his front porch wondering what to do, and a police officer drove up and said, "Get in the car, I'll drive you to safety." And the true believer said, No, don't worry about it. Go on without me. The Lord will provide." And so the floodwaters broke, and all of a sudden the water started coming higher and higher, and he had to leave his front porch. And he was up on the second level of his house, and somebody in his neighborhood came by with a rowboat, and they went right up to his house, and they said, get in, come on, I'll take you to safety." And the true believer said, "No, go on without me, the Lord will provide." And then finally the water got high all the way up to the guy's roof, and he was standing on his roof, and a helicopter flew in low, said, "You're the last person in the neighborhood, come on, get on the rope ladder, we'll carry you to safety." And the true believer said, No, don't worry about it, go on without me, the Lord will provide." And the person died. And so God asked him, he said, "Well, what happened down there?" And he said, "Well, I had true faith in you. I knew that you would provide. How come I died?" And the Lord said, "I sent a police car and a rowboat and a helicopter. You had to get on one of those things that I sent for you." So I know I get kind of excited when I'm talking about things that are kind of dear to me. If this is something that you're interested in researching, I would strongly recommend that you do further research about religious trauma syndrome. I found it very illuminating for me personally. There were a lot of things that I can recognize in myself and the way that I reacted to things. I do not have the answers. I just know what the answer isn't for me. So if you would find some comfort, or you would find this topic of research interesting for you, I'm going to include a couple different websites and some resources that I found in the last couple of weeks of researching this topic. But in the meantime, if it's something that you've enjoyed watching, thank you for spending some time here with me today, and I look forward to seeing whatever comments you post down below. Thanks again for watching.